Hey everybody, welcome back to Be Like Christ. In today's video, we're going to talk about Matthew chapter 9 in 5 minutes. And as always, if you want the handout that you're about to see up on the screen, there's a link down below to this handout and a lot of other helpful Bible resources that are available for free on our website at tobelikechrist.com. Matthew chapter 9, when did the events of this chapter take place? Well, like with the majority of this book, it all took place during Jesus' ministry. That would be around AD 26 to AD 31, somewhere in between there. There's a lot going on in this chapter, and so we have a lot of key characters. Jesus is our first key character. We've already been introduced to him. And there's a paralyzed man who is brought to Jesus for healing. We are introduced to Matthew, and Matthew was one of the 12 apostles, but originally he was a tax collector who Jesus called to follow him. He's also known as Levi. Chapter 9 also features some of John the Baptist's disciples. They have a question for Jesus, and they're going to come up to him and ask. Then we have a ruler's daughter, and she's going to be resurrected from the dead. We'll talk about that in a second. And there's a woman with an issue of blood, or a flow of blood that is healed by Jesus in the streets. And then our last two, we've got two blind men who cried out to Jesus for healing, and a mute man. He was possessed by a devil and he couldn't speak, and Jesus is going to cast out the demon. Okay, so where are we at in the world in chapter 9 of Matthew? Well, the first 34 verses all take place kind of in and around the city or the town of Capernaum. It's where Jesus spent a lot of time. The last 4 verses, it says that they took place in cities and villages around the area, but we're not told anything more specific than that. All right, so now for our outline, verses 1 through 8, Jesus is going to meet a paralyzed man. And he meets this paralyzed man after he leaves the Gadarenes, where he healed those 2 demon-possessed men in the last chapter. The paralyzed man was brought to him, and he said to the man, "Take heart, your sins are forgiven." Now, some of the Jewish leaders, they really had a problem with the fact that Jesus claimed to be able to forgive sins. But in order to show them that he had that authority, he went ahead and he did the physical sign of healing the paralyzed man in front of them. And then in verses 9 through 13, Matthew, also known as Levi, is called to be a disciple. Matthew was a Roman tax collector, and Jesus found him, collecting taxes, and he called him, and Matthew got up and he left his tax booth. And then he invited Jesus and his disciples to his house, where he invited a lot of other tax collectors and people who are just simply described as sinners. The Pharisees, they really looked down on Jesus because he was spending time with sinners. But Jesus looked at the Pharisees and he said, those who are well, or those who are healthy, they don't need a doctor. It's those who are sick who need the doctor. And then we have a pretty well-known text, verses 14 through 17. Jesus tells a parable. John's disciples, John the Baptist's disciples, come up to Jesus and they ask him why his disciples don't practice the discipline of fasting. Jesus told these guys that his disciples didn't fast because it would be inappropriate for them to do that while he was still on the earth with them. To illustrate the point, he tells 2 parables, the parable of the wineskins and the parable of the garment. In verses 18 through 34, there's a lot going on here, so I just entitled it, Jesus Performs Various Miracles. This guy, who is described as a ruler, he notifies Jesus that his daughter has died and he wants Jesus to help. So Jesus is on his way to help. He meets this woman who had this issue of blood. She had had this problem for 12 years, and she had seen all the doctors. They couldn't heal her, but she touches Jesus' garment and she's healed. Jesus finally gets to the ruler's house, and there he finds the ruler's daughter dead, and he raises her from the dead. Passing on a little bit further, Jesus met 2 blind men and he healed them. And then he healed this interesting case of a man who was possessed by a demon, and this demon made him mute, or unable to speak. And then finally, in verses 35 through 38, Jesus just goes throughout the towns and the villages, and he's preaching about the kingdom of heaven and inviting people into it. It says that while he was doing this, he was moved with compassion for all the people who came to him with their needs, and he healed many people and he helped many people. And he said to his disciples, quote, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." When we think about this chapter in the big picture of the Bible, it teaches us a really powerful message. There's a lot of sick people, as you might have noticed in this chapter, a lot of suffering people. And we know that sickness and suffering and death entered the world because of sin. The Bible tells us that. But Jesus is proving in this chapter again and again and again that he has the power to reverse the negative side effects of sin, to make right what sin has and what a corrupted world has gotten wrong. And this is good news not just for the people that are healed here, but for all of us, right? That Jesus has the power to fix the things that have gone wrong. And that's ultimately what his promise is, the kingdom of heaven. Right? When Christ reigns on the throne and death is thrown down and sin is thrown down, and we get to live with God forever in a world that is devoid of sin and its effects. And then for application, in verse 37, as Jesus expressed, there's so much work to do in the harvest, right? In God's field, in God's work. There's so much work to do, but there aren't a lot of volunteers to do it. And that statement was true in Jesus' day, but I think it's also true in our generation. There's so many people in need, both physically and spiritually. Are we laboring to meet those needs? Or have we distracted ourselves with a lot of unimportant things? Additionally, are we praying what Jesus is telling us to pray, that God would send more people out to do the work to reach the lost? If not, we should be.